When we're observing our reference to draw, should we be focusing on the shape of things or the form of things? And what's the difference anyway? Let me explain to you the way I see it. Here we have two circles. Now, circles are shapes. They're two-dimensional. They're flat discs. Let's put some hatching on the left-hand circle. Now, we have a circle on the right-hand side as well. But I want us to imagine, to visualize this circle as being actually a sphere instead of a flat circle. Our circle, our two-dimensional shape, has height and width and nothing else. But our sphere has height and width, but it also has depth. If this were a ball, we know that this part of the ball is going to be the part that's closest to us, and what we see at these ends silhouetted here are further away from us. We also know that there's a corresponding point for this closest center point on the other side of the ball, which will be the furthest part of the ball away from us. This shape is actually a form. It has height and width and depth. Let's put this same hatching now on our sphere so that we can better visualize that it's a form, not a shape, that it's three-dimensional, not two-dimensional. Does this give a sense of what I'm talking about? Now, when we're drawing from a reference, whether the reference is a photo or it's in front of us, we have to grapple with these two aspects of the visual world, of seeing shapes and seeing form. What's the most helpful way to view things when we draw? Let me show you how this can look with an example. Here we have our subject. It's one that I drew for an earlier video. When we focus on shape, we're focusing on the height and width. When we look at this structure, this wall here we're seeing as this four-sided shape. So even though there is depth here, even though this is a wall that's moving away from us, we don't focus on that. We don't see that. In fact, we work hard not to see that because that can easily mislead us when we draw the proportions of this shape. We can somehow add more width because we know that this is a longer wall than we see. Instead, I focus on shape. I disconnect this shape from what it is and where it is in what it is. So, I draw something like this. I draw a shape and I work at getting the proportions of width and height correct. I work at getting whatever angles there might be correct, because thinking of these things will help me get an accurate shape. Now, if I get all the shapes accurate, then I will have an accurate drawing. And this is the sort of drawing we can end up with when we focus on shape. We're after accuracy in whatever we see in terms of the two-dimensional height and width. And when we know there is depth, we try not to see it. We then assemble our shapes together, a lot like doing a jigsaw puzzle. Focusing on shapes can also lead us to see hatching, cross-hatching, as a way of really representing value of lights and darks in our scene. However, this also leads us wondering what's the right direction to hatch in, as if hatching is one thing, because we're only thinking of it as having one purpose. Because we see hatching as having one purpose, making things darker, it's easy to oversimplify how we might use it. And so we end up with a lot of lines going over the top of each other that do create quite discernible value, darknesses, but we're never sure what's the right direction. When we focus on shape, we have a lot of problem drawing things that, well, aren't a shape. If we look at this grass, well, yes, clearly the grass is a shape, but it's lots and lots of tiny shapes. And that's a problem because I can't draw all those shapes. So again, what I often do is I create these symbols, such as these little things here, to represent the shapes that are too hard to draw. And because I often get these from my childhood cartoon reading or children's storybook illustrations, everyone else is also familiar that these represent grass. So I switch to symbols because the shapes become too difficult. But sometimes the detail can be seen in terms of shapes, such as these stone bricks, these sandstone bricks. And so again, I draw lines that capture, that enclose the shapes that I see. And my aim is to be as accurate as possible with these shapes. Again, up here, I've kind of created a squiggly line pattern to represent the leaves in a similar way for a similar reason that I've done with the grass down here. It really is a pattern to represent the leaves, because what I can see here, the shapes I can see and the shapes I know are there, are just far too small and complex to draw. So I substitute a pattern. So when we focus on shape, this is how we're looking and drawing, and this is often the sort of drawing, for the reasons I've said, that we end up with. What happens if we think of form? This was the drawing I did for the video where I used this as my reference. Because I was drawing form, I'm thinking 3 dimensions. I'm thinking height, width, and depth. And so this corner is the closest part of this structure to me. Even this corner is further away, let alone this corner over here, which is some distance away. Now, when I'm thinking form, I'm thinking, how can I draw this that creates a sense of closer and of further away? The way things look in life using my pen, whatever I have. And because I'm not concentrating so much on these shapes, getting them accurate and then just placing them side by side together, almost like a jigsaw puzzle, I'm paying more attention to other aspects of my reference. So because I don't see this as a separate shape, I see it as one wall of a 3-dimensional shape. I'm looking carefully at where these sides join and the 3-dimensional effect we see when we look at them. I'm paying more attention to edges than can be represented in a straight line, because I'm looking at my building as a whole, and particularly how might I make marks with the things that are closer to me compared to the things further away for a sense of depth, but also how can I capture the effect of what I see, not just the outline. So whereas when I focus on shape, I'm focusing on accuracy of shape, when I'm focusing on form, I want to create something that looks and feels like it's moving back in space. I want to create a sense of this is closer to us than that, than this. That this block down here is closer than this block here. These sorts of things become important because I want, if you like,
I want to
the
capture how the roundedness of something looks in space
to
with the
be
marks
strong.
I use on my paper.
Now, thinking 3 dimensions doesn't just involve the main subject. I need to think that way for every detail in my reference. So these plants, the trees, the grass. However, once my focus is on a 3-dimensional form,
Even if it's an irregular form, such as a shrub,
my focus is then how can I hatch to create the feel, the effect of the 3-dimensional form at the distance and in the wider context of the drawing,
that will create a sense of reality.
so it becomes very clear there is no right way to hatch trees or anything else for that matter. It's what works, what creates the effect of 3 dimensions. With the grass, it's something similar. If you just look at what I did here, the most important thing to create a sense of form of 3 dimensions, that this plane that the outhouse sits on moves away from us in this direction, is to get the foreshortening captured, to get the fact that things get smaller and seem to be compressed, seem to come closer together as they move back in space.
So I have to experiment and find marks that will suggest all of this, but trusting the context will help me.
I can't really show you with this drawing because I put this line there. But if we look at this one, we can see that this closest corner, because it's closer, we see more detail. We see all these little chips and nicks, and where the mortar hasn't quite reached the corners or whether the corners have been knocked off.
We see all the imperfections for whatever reason on the edge.
So if I want to create a sense of 3 dimensions of this edge, because this edge actually has form, it has little bits taken out of it. It's not a smooth coming together of 2 planes. Then I need to find marks that will create that feel. So I show more detail in what's closer. Perhaps I use some heavier lines in what's closer. When I come down here, I'm particularly paying attention to these points where there often is a little indent, which is part of the 3-dimensional form that we have. And if I want to have a realistic 3-dimensional looking drawing, then I need to some degree, capture, at least in some cases, the form that we have there.
And remember, we draw as much by where we don't put lines or marks or ink on the paper as where we do.
I also use different weights of line, different heaviness of line, as well as gaps. So when I draw, is my focus on shape or form? And the answer, it's on both in quite a definite order. When I first look at my reference, I particularly focus on shape. I particularly focus on the relationship of height to width. I focus on the angles. I focus on the different parts of the jigsaw puzzle that, if we were to cut all the shapes out, would form the pieces. But when I go to draw, I don't want to start drawing as if I'm drawing the pieces of the puzzle. Instead, I want to put marks down. I want to create edges that are as 3-dimensional as my subject is 3-dimensional, that if there's a roundedness on the edges through weathering or through being made that way, then I want to give a sense of that weathering, those little chips. We talk about creating a sense of reality with our marks, but this is what does it. It's representing all of the small 3-dimensionalities of our subject, not just the main ones. Even with our trees, I look at the shape of the canopy as a silhouette. Now, I capture that. Now, of course, this isn't a drawing of a tree. This tree is very much in the background. When the tree is the subject, I visualize the shape first. But if you've seen any of my videos where trees are the whole subject, you'll see that I don't do a heavy line outline around the silhouette. I do a series of dots that mark out the silhouette in as much detail as I think I need to be able to get the proportions of the canopy correct.
I use different marks differently to define the edge in a more realistic way.
And my hatching is whatever direction will create a sense of 3 dimensions, will create the interplay of light and dark that gives roundedness. When I first started drawing in a serious way, my focus was on shape. It was on seeing the shapes, the angles, and copying them as accurately as I could.
Using lines.
But there's more to perceiving form than just the perspective being in the correct way. Because when I start looking at form, I'm now looking at surfaces and edges in a new way as well. And I'm particularly paying attention to how those edges and surfaces visually change as the form changes in relation to where we are observing from. It's not just that the perspective angles change, but how clearly we see things change, whether they're closer, further away, or further away again. And therefore the sorts of marks we're going to use, whether we're hatching or doing something else, will need to change if we're going to capture that form. It's not just the form of individual items, individual subjects, it's the form of the whole scene. So, shape versus form. What do we concentrate on when we draw? Well, I like to have the best of both methods. So when I visualize, I focus on shape at first to really understand what I'm seeing. And when I start to put marks on the paper, I'm putting them on the paper to establish that sort of shape. But I don't do a heavy straight line to establish the shape. Instead, I make some marks that leave me the ability to strengthen some parts of this, if you like, line, soften other parts, make it look more ragged with other marks, to create the effect, the three-dimensional effect of what we see on this edge. Because I'm now thinking form. When I start to put the marks that will be the finished marks, the final marks, I'm always thinking form, not shape. Are we focusing on shape or form? I would recommend shape first and then use what we've learnt from that shape study to draw more accurate and more realistic looking form. G'day, I'm Stephen Travers. I hope you found this interesting. I often hear the word shapes and forms and finding shapes and looking at the form bandied around, not always with a great deal of consistency. But this is the way I think, this is the way I use these words, and this is, more importantly, the way I use them in understanding my process of drawing. But hey, in the end, however you draw, however you want things to look, however they end up looking, make sure you have fun. I'll see you next time. Bye.